As a land-grant institution, the UCLA Academic Senate acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, which includes the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. I would like to welcome all of you to the 131st Faculty Research Lectureship, which is sponsored by the Los Angeles Division of the Academic Senate and the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activities. I am Academic Senate Chair Jody Kryman, and it is my honor to host this faculty research lecture, which presents the work of some of UCLA's most eminent and distinguished scholars. The purpose of the lecture is to allow the university, the Academic Senate, and the Office of Research and Creative Activities to recognize the faculty for their superb achievements and to give the campus and the wider community the opportunity to gain new perspectives on scholarly achievements through the findings of the faculty members who are honored by the lectureship. The faculty research lecture was initiated in 1925. In 1986, the program was expanded to 2 lectures per annum, one from the natural sciences or engineering, the other from the humanities, social science disciplines, or creative arts. Now, I would like to present Interim Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost Michael Levine, who will introduce our lecturer.
Thank you, Chair Kryman, and welcome to those joining us for UCLA's 131st Faculty Research Lecture. It is my pleasure to offer a few remarks and introduce today's speaker. The Faculty Research Lecture is both one of UCLA's great honors as well as a public forum for the presentation of scholarly research of the highest caliber. As one of the leading research universities in the world, we are fortunate to be home to distinguished faculty who have generated some of the most transformative breakthroughs in our time. In this lecture series, we recognize our outstanding scholars and celebrate the ways in which their contributions have reshaped their disciplines and changed our world. Today's lecturer, Professor Chon Noriega, has been at UCLA and within the Los Angeles film community for 30 years. Professor Noriega currently serves as a distinguished professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media, and until last year was also director of our Chicano Research Center. In these roles, he has studied Chicano and Latino arts through aesthetic, social, and institutional lenses. His work focuses on the history and analysis of national and ethnic cinemas, the study of avant-garde film and experimental media, and policy-oriented research on barriers to access for creative personnel from underrepresented minority backgrounds working in the film industry. He is the author of the book Shot in America, Television, the State, and the Rise of Chicano Cinema, co-author of Phantom Sightings, Art After the Chicano Movement, and co-author of Home, So Different, So Appealing. Professor Noriega's critical analyses of Chicano and Latino art and culture, coupled with his examination of Hollywood's representations of these communities, have cemented UCLA's status as a leading hub for scholarship on such topics. Additionally, in an effort to preserve Latino history and bring greater visibility to Latino art, Professor Noriega has actively archived the works and papers of individual filmmakers and artists, art groups, and community-based arts institutions. These efforts have helped the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center become the world's largest archive of scholarly material pertaining to people of Mexican descent. Professor Noriega earned his undergraduate degree in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago and his master's and PhD in modern thought and literature from Stanford University. Among other honors, he is the recipient of the 2021-2022 Guggenheim Fellowship. He is currently working on a new book about destructivist artist Rafael Montanez Ortiz. Professor Noriega's presentation today is titled Destruction in Art, Art in Destruction. We are very fortunate to have such a distinguished member of the UCLA community share his insights on this fascinating subject. And now I present UCLA's 131st Faculty Research Lecturer, Professor Chon Noriega.
I want to thank the Academic Senate for this incredible honor, Interim Executive Vice Chancellor Michael Levine for his introduction, and the great staff here who are making this presentation possible. I want to thank also the wonderful people I come into contact week to week who make UCLA an exciting and rewarding place to work. Staff members, faculty, researchers, librarians, and students. And I want to give a special shout out to my colleagues on the council and academic personnel. Our considerable time together each week has deepened my appreciation of the many disciplines that make up a university. The UCLA Faculty Research Lectureship is distinct in showcasing to a broad community of scholars across campus, as well as to the general public. While this event is usually done in person and in an auditorium such as this one, the fact that the lecture is online will also make it more widely available. That said, I wish you were all here in person. I will start on a personal note. My earliest memories are of the arts. My father played rancheras on our record player every weekend, eventually teaching himself to play guitar and sing these archetypal Mexican songs himself. He also sang Johnny Cash songs and Cuban boleros. My mother sewed our clothes from scratch and taught herself quilting and interior decorating. When I was around 8 years old, I dragged home a broken sofa left on the curb by a neighbor down the street. Rather than get upset with me, she invited me to learn with her how to rebuild and reupholster furniture. During the day, my parents worked hard, but evenings and weekends they played, painting, writing poetry, learning ballet, cooking, reading, and going to museums. My parents taught me and my sister to hold the world in awe, and that we could learn to contribute to, not just appreciate or fear that world. But how to apply to college? Well, that was another matter. My parents were both high school graduates. My sister and I are the first generation to graduate from college, let alone earn PhDs and teach at research universities. For as long as I've been a scholar, I've also been involved in archival preservation with an emphasis on filmmakers, visual artists, performance artists, arts organizations, and arts advocacy groups. At this moment, my faculty office is filled with the papers of veteran filmmaker Silvia Morales. I have also been an active curator working with museums and other art spaces for over 30 years. Curated exhibitions involve the same amount of research as does academic scholarship. If writing thinks through words and documents, exhibition thinks through objects, images, and space. As a viewer, one should engage and appreciate the individual works of art that are on display. But an exhibition also poses questions, explores connections, and creates dialogues in a way that is nonverbal, associative, and corporeal. Basically, you feel your way through an exhibition. That is, an exhibition gives you an opportunity to think through art with your whole body. Here are slides of several exhibitions I have worked on over the last 30 years. This exhibition, Home So Different, So Appealing, involved 40 artists many of them producing large-scale installations exploring the universal concept of home across the Americas. This is Leila Cardenas in the center. That's the carpet that the artist Carmen Argote grew up on, turned into a painting and a sculpture. It's a Pepón Osorio's recreation of an actual jail cell and bedroom and a dialogue between the father and son. And Daniel Joseph Martinez's recreation to scale of the Unabomber's shack based on Thoreau's cabin on the Walden Pond. And Maria Elena Gonzalez's recreation of a floor plan from an apartment in Watts. And it was originally actually displayed at that site where the apartment building was. In doing this work over the last 30 years, I've been fortunate to collaborate on some of these exhibitions with other curators. And that includes Rita Gonzalez, Tere Romo, Pilar Tompkins Rivas, and Mari Carmen Ramirez. The title of my talk, Destruction in Art, Art and Destruction, no doubt raises some questions. Isn't art about creating, not destroying? Yes and no. Indeed, my story thus far has been about making, rebuilding, and also innovating. That is, to bring in new things. But in the arts, innovation can build upon tradition, or it can reject an existing tradition and begin a new one. Artists often speak of their practice as one of making way for something creative, which means not just bringing in new things, but clearing a space for them. My goal is not to provide an overview of destruction in the arts, but rather to look at destruction in art in the mid-20th century by way of an individual artist, Rafael Montañez Ortiz, born in 1934 and still active as an artist today at the age of 88. My goal is to place Ortiz's art and ideas into historical context with which they are in dialogue. For reasons that I hope become clear by the end, I avoid a singular and linear narrative, and instead, borrowing from novelist Julio Cortázar, I will hopscotch across time. Rafael Montañez Jr. was born on January 29 or 30, 1934, in the Puerto Rican barrio in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. His birth certificate lists January 29, but in the delivery room, Eusebia Velázquez had her eyes on the clock, and she insisted that her son was born 1 minute after midnight. And so the artist uses January 30 as his birthday. Velázquez was born in 1913 in Vieques, an island off the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. She migrated to New York City in 1931, joining her older sister as a sewing machine operator in a sweatshop in the Lower East Side. The sisters, later joined by an older brother and his family in 1940, were part of an out-migration in search of work as the Great Depression decimated the island's economy, which was dependent on sugar plantations. For Ortiz, his mother's experience superseded the official documentation, at least in the artist's personal life and public statements. But as a matter of record, archived within the institutions of the state, his existence started the day before his mother's own experience of giving birth. It is as if the archive were already pushing the newborn child into the past, as though the present and future had no space for him, no hope. Indeed, the past into which the archive pushed Ortiz is one in which he would be neither a U.S. citizen nor a Spanish subject, but rather a native without a homeland. Although Ortiz started as an abstract expressionist painter in the 1950s, he would become an artist recognized internationally as a pioneer in post-object art forms that placed an emphasis on ideas, problem solving, and viewer engagement as part of the artwork. Ortiz's work represents the broad sweep of new art forms since the 1950s: recycled films and music, mixed media sculpture, installation art, performance art, guerrilla theater, destruction concerts, and computer art. Ortiz never identified with post-abstract expressionist movements, such as assemblage, fluxus, neo-dada, new realism, pop art. Instead, he preferred to conceptualize his work in terms of destructivism. More than anything, Ortiz found kindred spirit and support from two original participants in the Berlin Dadaist movement in the early 20th century, who were then living in New York City, Richard Hulsenbeck and Lil Picard, both born at the end of the 19th century. At the urging of Hulsenbeck, MoMA's founding director, Alfred Barr, acquired archaeological find number 3, which you see in the slide here, helping Ortiz place it into the artist's station wagon. The two men carried the large work into the museum themselves. Today, examples of his diverse work reside in major permanent collections, including New York's MoMA and the Whitney Museum of American Art, London's Tate Modern, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. As a child listening to radio late at night, first for news about his stepfather fighting in World War II, and then about Hiroshima and the Nuremberg trials, Ortiz was part of a generation that questioned rather than idealized rationality and tool-making. The atom bomb and the Holocaust served as touchstones for an understanding among artists, intellectuals, and activists that humans could now destroy the world. Homo exterminatum, I knew this would happen. My Latin's not so good. Homo exterminatore, man the destroyer. Today, this world-destroying capacity is used to define a new epoch, the Anthropocene. But in the 1950s and 1960s, it marked a shift in the arts from thematic and formal engagements through traditional mediums to a blurring of the boundaries between art, objects, and the world. Back then, the language was different, and today it may seem outdated and misdirected, but at its root, there is a similar concern that what humans made is now threatening the world that sustains us. For Ortiz, the answer was to unmake. And so from 1957 to 1964, he destroyed factory-made consumer goods found in his own apartment. Film reels for home movie projection, mattresses, and sofas, transforming them into new art objects. Since 1966, he has performed numerous piano destruction concerts. With the films and pianos, he used an axe. Hand axes were the earliest human tools dating back over 1.75 million years ago. Developed after evolutionary changes activated a brain network that is also involved in modern piano playing. Pianos are among the earliest factory-made objects that entered the home, doing so as symbols of social status and as instruments for disciplining and performing class-based gender roles. In Ortiz's piano destruction concerts, the pianos are transformed into sculptural artifacts of each instrument's last concert, wherein Ortiz uses an axe to play the piano out of existence as a piano. In some cases, a concert was videotaped, and the recording either added to the work as part of the installation or attached as documentation. The artwork thus acquired loose boundaries, becoming at once a ritual performance, shards gathered up by concert attendees, statements circulating in mass media, an object that enters into an art collection, photographic and video documentation, and all the things the artist has said about that work. There is also an inherent institutional dimension. The sculptural object itself is defined not as the sum total of all the piano's broken parts, but as those things within an area that the museum art registrar marks out as constituting the artwork. Beneath these formal concerns and the cultural history of the home, Ortiz understood that art draws from the newly developed brain network of Homo habilis, the tool-making man that preceded Homo sapiens, the wise men. Playing Mozart requires the cognitive toolkit that developed while making hand axes to destroy objects. In 1960, in his studio, Ortiz picked up a wet paintbrush from a stack of paper towels, only to have the brush pull up several layers of paper, leaving behind an almost sculptural artifact with paint soaked through the towels. Though Ortiz had been learning how to create art by adding layers of paint to a canvas, he found in his chance destruction of a utilitarian and disposable object something not conceived as art per se, but a more radical and personal act, the artist's gesture as destructive rather than creative. His earlier recycled films in 1957 and 1958 had explored ritual destruction of commercial cinema. Now Ortiz found in this messy contingency in his studio a method that could be applied to the artwork itself. Instead of using canvas, he stapled paper towels to a sheet of cardboard and soaked them with paint and oil, using a paintbrush to remove rather than add to its surface. In Sunburst, the image on the left here, the gold paint referenced both Catholic imagery and the conquest of the Americas, while the fragile paper gave way to the artist's attempt to get beneath the surface to an underlying something, whether a truth, a spirit, or a void. Other works followed a similar process. Monument to Buchenwald, which is the image on the right, Children of Treblinka, and Nailed Marshmallows, to name a few. In these early works, the emphasis was placed on materiality and technique, shifting from paint to objects, and from painterly layering to laceration. These objects had a symbolic relationship to Ortiz's family history, cultural genealogy, his affinities and experiences growing up in the still largely Jewish Lower East Side, setting them against the long historical arc of colonialism. But something was missing. Robert Richenberg, more than any other teacher, encouraged Ortiz to pursue his interest in destruction, while also insisting that he do in-depth research on the topic of destruction, write a manifesto, and look for a gallery, all of which Ortiz did in short order. Richenberg was a well-known abstract painter. He and Ortiz often engaged in ongoing dialogue about destruction, including through their artwork, as each struggled to situate destruction within their artistic practice, and not just as a theme to be abstracted from the surface of their canvases. As Ortiz moved toward mixed media forms, Richenberg pushed him to engage the personal, not the symbolic dimension of destruction. As Ortiz recalls, and I'm quoting, "He insisted I make sure that what I destroy is mine and not somebody else's. By 1964, every piece of furniture I owned found its way destroyed into my thesis exhibition. With each critique, Bob would smilingly say, 'Ralph, you're the only student here who knows the real sacrifices the artist often makes for their art.'" This turn between 1961 and 1964 reimagined the ritual of his earlier recycled films, adding laughter, that is, Richenberg's knowing smile that Ortiz had traced the big sweep of history that fascinated him, from the Spanish conquest of the Americas to the Holocaust, back to his own home. In the 20th century, the home was not a retreat from the world, but rather a home of objects connected to the world at large: radio, telephone, television, electrical appliances. It is a home of possessions, objects that we claim to own, but that structure our space and movements. In works such as Archaeological Find 21 and Archaeological Find 22, Ortiz tore into, destroyed, and transformed mattresses, sofas, and chairs in his own home in Brooklyn, where he lived with his wife and son. Given that these works became the basis for his MFA degree and subsequent career as an educator, and established him as an artist collected by major museums and championed by leading figures in the arts, the relationship between home and the art world was not only direct, it was zero-sum. Ortiz was perhaps the first artist to describe such destructions in terms of archaeology, calling his works archaeological finds. In contrast to traditional archaeology, which retrieves, conserves, and makes whole the ruins of the past, the artist's own actions transform a present-day object into an irreparable ruin and thereby release something hidden within the very making of the object. Other artists have followed suit, including Gordon Matta Clark, Doris Salcedo, Leila Cárdenas, and Gabriel de la Mora, who have often described their works as constituting an archaeology of the present. The history derived from objects and the history derived from documents, basically archaeology and the field of history, often try to restore a sense of wholeness. But what if the past was never whole? What if the past, like the present, is a time of discordance and rupture? Video artist Namjoon Paik describes this paradox. You dig up ruins after ruins to understand the past, as if you know something about the present. While Ortiz's early destructions focused on the furniture in his home, his participation in the Destruction and Art Symposium in London in 1966 signaled an artistic shift away from objects and toward his own body. Ortiz performed a number of destructions around London, including his first piano destruction concerts and self-destruction at the Mercury Theatre. One audience member at self-destruction recounted, quoting, Ortiz paraded around in diapers, drinking bottles of milk. Throughout his number, Ortiz is shouting, Mommy, Daddy, at the top of his lungs. At the end of his act, he vomits. Plastic bags are passed out, and the audience is requested to follow suit. Ortiz described the climax in slightly more interpretive terms that echoed the language of psychoanalytic therapy, including that from his own sessions at the time. Mommy rejected me. I'm going to reject her. I throw up, first spontaneously, then deliberately sticking my finger down my throat, vomiting up about 2 pints of milk. I then slap the puddle of vomit angrily over and over, calling, Mommy, Mommy. Accepting the puddle of milk as symbolic of Mommy, I calm down. Then I crawl out, Mommy, Ma. This audience member returned to Los Angeles and brought up his experience at a group therapy session with psychotherapist Arthur Janoff, who immediately suggested that the young man try screaming at his parents in absentia. With Janoff's persistence, the man tried screaming, resulting in a breakthrough for a patient identified as hysteric. I can feel, he said. The efficacy of this approach inspired Janoff to develop primary therapy over the next 3 years. In the opening page of Janoff's 1970 book, The Primal Screen, seen here on the screen, he explains the impact of that moment. Some years ago, I heard something that was to change the course of my professional life and the lives of my patients. What I heard may change the nature of psychotherapy as it is now known. He describes what he heard as simply a story about a man named Ortiz who was currently doing an act on the London stage. Once the book was published, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who also performed at Diaz alongside of Ortiz, would become the early primal therapy patients under Janoff, traveling to Malibu to work with him. I just throw this slide in. Ortiz and Janoff had never met, and working with a friend of mine, Agustin Gursa, who recently passed away, is a journalist. He knew Janoff and I knew Ortiz, and we brought them together, and it was really quite a phenomenal meeting, and the videotape of that is actually on YouTube. On May 4th, 1970, just hours after the Kent State Massacre in Ohio, in which the National Guard shot and killed 4 college students protesting the war in Cambodia, Ortiz joined Richard Schechner and Joan McIntosh from the performance group in developing a guerrilla theater with about 15 college students. The next morning, they reenacted Kent State in front of about 1,000 viewers at the New York University and then off campus, where police argued with onlookers about the slaughterhouse blood that they had spilled on the street. One of the police finally said, exasperated, "People who mess up public streets should be shot." This image of the guerrilla theater enactment that you see on the right appeared on the front page of the New York Post, providing a visual counterpart to the news stories about the Kent State killings and growing student unrest across the nation in response. In the image, a woman fears for her child's safety. She leans her body into the handle of the baby carriage, pushing it with full force across the street while looking back in terror. While the image caption identified the scene as a guerrilla theater, the photograph itself registers a more generalized shock about the American university. Here, the campus is no longer a site of aspiration for the traditional middle-class family, but instead a threat to its very reproduction. This action was one of many that Ortiz organized or participated in during May 1970, including anti-war demonstrations in Washington, D.C. You see on the left here, and you get a sense of their use of kind of slaughterhouse blood and organs that they got from a butcher. Protests at MoMA, organized by the Black and Puerto Rican artists of the Art Workers Coalition, you see on the right, and a citywide art strike. In that moment, destruction as art had an immediacy that rivaled television and consumer culture, even if it found an outlet there as well. While symbolic, such destruction was also quite visceral, using slaughterhouse blood, brains, hearts, lungs, and other organs. What Ortiz's survival manual for blood and flesh guerrilla theater made clear, he wrote this in 1968, is that actual blood and not civil debate had become the lingua franca of American politics. By the end of 1970, Ortiz ended his visceral destructions, shifting from animal sacrifice to psychic healing, although he continues his object-based destructions. I'm going to end by returning to the year of Ortiz's birth in 1934. And in that year, believe it or not, the National Archives was created, becoming the repository for all federal records of the United States of America. And prior to that, preservation of federal records fell to the U.S. Secretary of State, the President's chief foreign affairs advisor. So this is a moment of origin in terms of a sense of history about the United States. In laying the cornerstone for the building, President Herbert Hoover described the archive in religious and aesthetic terms. This temple of our history will appropriately be one of the most beautiful buildings in America, an expression of the American soul. This is more than just empty rhetoric. When an archive becomes a temple, the archival boxes become reliquaries, and historical knowledge a sacral obligation on the part of the citizen to remember rather than learn the nation's past. It's as though we are born with that past. This obligation is the underside of birthright, but it is also an essential framing of historical thought itself. The consequence is, to approach history on other terms becomes a sacrilegious act, literally the stealing of sacred things from the temple. Art is a crucial part of this formulation. Two sculptures that you see here on the slide by Robert Aitken introduced the public mission of the new federal institution. They're called Past and Future. Past features an older man, bald and bearded, seated with his left arm draped over a closed book on his lap. The figure looks down toward the viewer. An inscription on the pedal base commands, "Study the past." Future features a young woman sitting with her left arm draped over an open book. She looks up from the book in contemplation. Inscribed on the pedal base is the phrase, "What is past is prologue." Past and future allegorize the ideal citizen as a product of learning the nation's history, although it is an allegory that depends heavily on normative notions of race, gender, sexuality, and family as hallmarks of social reproduction. Let's consider the phrase that frames the scene in Future. It is taken from Act 2, Scene 1 of William Shakespeare's The Tempest in 1610. And by that destiny to perform an act, whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the play, the phrase is uttered as part of an inducement to commit murder. And at the play's end, it does not succeed. In this light, the inscription from the Tempest introduces irony into the monument's allegory about the nation's archive as a source of a glorious future. It is the irony of colonial violence in the New World. After all, the Tempest appears to be set in the Caribbean. And the play's natives, Ariel and Caliban, have been touchstones of Latin American political thought since 1898, a date that marks the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas and the start of North American imperialism in Latin America. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1898, the U.S. became a colonial power, annexing Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines with a $20 million payment to Spain. By the way, that payment was finally paid off in 2006. We had been paying for it in our long distance bills, a surcharge tax. So that's brings us to the contemporary moment. That today, as in 1935, when the National Archive building opened, Guam and Puerto Rico remain an unincorporated organized territory of the United States. In other words, they are colonies. This vision is not the product of one statue alone. It is part and parcel of the larger design and placement of the National Archive buildings at the midpoint between the White House and the Capitol. In addition to past and future, there are two other statues outside the National Archives, Guardianship and Heritage, which you see here. These statues are by James Earl Fraser. The National Archives describes these four statues as sentinels of scholarship, further explaining these personifications represent the history of events, the learning of history for future action, cultural memory, and the preservation of historical knowledge. This militaristic framing of archival history is made explicit in the Fraser statues. Guardianship features a warrior with shield, helmet, and sword above the inscription, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." And Heritage features a bare-breasted mother with her male infant, a sheaf of wheat, and an urn. Above the inscription, "The heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future." If Atkin figured sovereignty and citizenship and the citizen in gendered terms centered on the acquisition of knowledge, here Fraser depicts the family as the site of action, military defense, agricultural harvest, and sexual reproduction. The inscriptions for Guardianship and Heritage are taken from abolitionist Wendell Phillips. The cruel irony here is that the quotation for Guardianship references vigilance against domestic despotism and not an external threat requiring military defense. As with Future, the inscription radically changes the context and meaning of the original text. And together, the four statues conflate family, nation, and violence against others with the archive-based study of the past. What I find fascinating here is the role that art plays in approaching the archive with an answer already in hand. But what makes the National Archives a phenomenal resource is not that it expresses the American soul, as Hoover proclaimed, but that it gives evidence of many histories, many answers, including about art. In my research into Ortiz's family history, using some of these archival holdings, I became aware of the extent to which art was a key part of Puerto Rican resistance to both Spanish and US colonial rule. I've actually published a lengthy article about this history at greater length in the trilingual journal Tapuya, Latin American Science, Technology, and Society. What I found is that the political figures in Puerto Rico that were seeking either equality or independence were often themselves painters and art collectors, but they were also scientists and physicians. And they saw art as core to new educational and cultural institutions that advanced their political and nationalist goals, starting with natural scientist Agustin Stahl, who was the first to call for a Puerto Rican National Museum in 1882. In 1902, Several paintings by a native of Puerto Rico were used as an occasion to challenge tariffs and thereby establish Puerto Ricans were now Americans, and hence they were also citizens, since citizenship and nationality were considered coterminous. The U.S. Attorney General issued an opinion that the painter in question was indeed an American artist relative to the Tariff Act, but not a U.S. citizen. 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court used this precedent to reject Isabel Gonzalez's petition for full citizenship, thereby establishing a new legal distinction between citizenship and nationality in the United States, one that is still operative and also largely unknown. Ortiz's family history is intertwined with that of the archive as an institution of the state. Within the National Archives reside ample evidence across all branches of government that Puerto Ricans have at times been central to what it means to be an American. And yet Puerto Ricans remain on the margins of U.S. history as it is told. I've tried to tell a different kind of history, one that hopscotches among the conventions of archival practice and storytelling, suggesting other perspectives on the past. This is an abbreviated story about a man named Ortiz, who, as an artist since the 1950s, has broken things and made the wreckage beautiful in its abstraction from the world. An abstraction not of rational thought, lofty ideals, aesthetic unity, or sacral belief, but an abstraction into the conflicted wholeness of our being as human animals. I've known Raphael for 30 years, and I'm still getting to know him despite dozens of oral history interviews, regular conversations, and immersion into his extensive archival papers, which are at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. I would like to end this talk by giving him the last word. I will show two brief excerpts from a 1966 destruction concert at the Destruction and Art Symposium in London. The performance itself is unusual insofar as it was staged for a segment on American television rather than presented in the context of music and visual arts. But in the last 90 seconds, you hear him explain destruction in art and what it meant to him nearly 60 years ago.
Events in London saw the end to a symposium on the destruction of the arts this week, and now some of the demonstrations begin. I'm a little concerned about this. I always thought that the arts was drawing form out of chaos. You're doing just the opposite, and yet you call yourself an artist. How can you explain that?
Well, I can say that the arts have been compromising art all these years because most of the arts that form don't allow for the instincts to be expressed, the aggressive and destructive instincts. And finally, destructivist art allows for that. It allows for a full expression. It gives full vent to the instincts.
Well, how far are you prepared to take destruction? As far as murder, for example?
No. In fact, destructivist art exists because it exists, murder exists in society and war exists in society. The society hasn't been able to really present a form that could use the destructive instincts and the aggressive instincts in a way that can serve the civilization. And destructivist art is giving that way. And perhaps if destructivist art became an important movement in a civilization, then perhaps the wars would end, perhaps murders would end, perhaps suicides would end.
Well, I hope there's one art form you're not going to consider destroying.
Well, what art form is that?
Your television set.
My television set.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here for this talk. And I want to acknowledge up front that Rafael Montañez Ortiz is also watching with us tonight. Rafael, thank you for your art, for your convictions, and for your friendship. Now, my talk had to overlook many important things about Rafael's life and body of work. But one thing I want to acknowledge here before starting the Q&A is that Rafael was founder of the first Latino art museum in the United States, El Museo del Barrio, in 1969. So he not only destroyed, but he created as well. And El Museo has an amazing retrospective of his work up right now through September 11th. And it will travel to Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, opening there on October 15th. I'm really honored to be joined here by two colleagues and dear friends, Jennifer Gonzalez and Roberto Tejada. They are scholars who bring political commitments as well as poetic and philosophical sensibilities. Jennifer is professor of art history at UC Santa Cruz, and Roberto is a professor of English, creative writing, and art history at Rice. Now, am I getting this wrong now? They have numerous publications, so I will note the ones they wrote for the Alvera Revisioning Art History book series that I edit. Jennifer wrote on Pepón Osorio and Roberto on Celia Alvarez Munoz. And I'll also acknowledge, despite not knowing where Roberto teaches, that he is also the author of the poetry book on my nightstand right now, Why the Assembly Disbanded. So Jennifer, Roberto, please just get us started.
Great. Hey, lovely talk, Chon. Is it okay if I start, Roberto?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So what a pleasure to hear your talk today, Chon. Thank you so much. And I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation to join the conversation. This really rich and layered talk about Ortiz invites us to think about history of imperialist relations that motivated his creation of destruction or creative destruction at a time of US invasion of Cambodia and Vietnam. And as we all know, imperialist activities and destructions are occurring in the Ukraine today. So as I was hearing your talk, I was thinking a number of things, but we may want to ask ourselves this question: why humans like to destroy things? Why do we like to destroy things? Buildings, children, ecosystems, the Earth's atmosphere. Indeed, it seems to be perhaps for me the most important question humans have left unresolved. We know that compared to the Department of Defense budget, funds spent to understand the origins of violence and funds spent to support nonviolent actions are minuscule. So we want to think about human beings. Your talk really raises for me these questions that are, I think, deeply pertinent. And art invites us to imagine other forms of being in the world. What I loved about this talk was the way it wove this charismatic artist's really unorthodox performances with the larger questions of archives and history, colonialism and war, destruction as activism. So the destruction art of Rafael Ortiz also invites us to be self-conscious of other kinds of destruction. He implies, however, that art has a kind of cathartic effect at the very end, the last little videos you showed. In other words, that art might serve as a kind of therapy for our destructive tendencies. In short, and to oversimplify, if we smashed pianos, we might not need to go to war. And I've heard similar arguments about the cathartic effect of video games, which seems like a different kind of animal. At the end of the segment on the piano destruction, Ortiz destroys or pretends to destroy a television screen inviting us to think about how even forms of representation might need to be rethought in a kind of, I felt very McLuhan-esque way at the end there. So I guess I have a question. I have several questions, so I might just ask them now and you can pick which ones you feel like responding to, if that's okay. So a kind of tangential question, which maybe we can loop back to, is at a time when free speech is being scrutinized on public sites like Twitter, we might ask, what are our new temples of historical knowledge? In other words, how do we think about representations that are allowed to stand and representations that might need to be destroyed? And who gets to make those decisions? And how does Ortiz invite us to think about those things? So that was sort of a question that came up just now while I was hearing again the end of his performance discussion. I also wanted to ask Chon to speak a little bit more about the relationship between artistic archival aesthetics, such as the creation of artifacts that appear historical, as Ortiz does in some of his early work, and scholarly archival practice that relies upon the institutional veracity of archives and the promise they keep for the future. So I guess I'm inviting you to think out loud about how you see them as similar or different. Do they have different kinds of temporalities, artistic forms of archival labor and scholarly forms of archival labor? And what might new public archives look like, and how might we see arts intervention in them? And then kind of my last two questions. One has to do with home and homeland, and the other one has to do with women. So home and homeland, citizenship and nationality underlie your analysis as well. We begin with the mama and move to the dada, but eventually seem to leave the nuclear test, or the nuclear nest rather, altogether. Can you say more about those aspects of Ortiz's work that are less destructive and incendiary, and that seek to create a home or a community, such as his work with El Museo del Barrio, which you mentioned at the end of your talk just now? Okay, and then finally, and then I'll be quiet. Women were a central part of the anti-war movement in the 1960s, as they are today. Can you say more about how the collaborations Ortiz may have had with women in his artistic practice may have shaped that artistic practice? So those are my questions, and I look forward to more discussion.
Okay, well, I don't know if I should begin. I mean, I'll begin a little bit of a response and then let Roberto raise some questions. I think you've just given me questions that some of which I'm kind of grappling with in the book, and others of which I think will make the book even longer, which is not a bad thing per se. But I think in terms of the archive, you mentioned artists' use of the archive, which you've written a beautiful book on, Subject to Display. And then the way the scholar approaches an archive. And most scholars, I think, approach the archive not really knowing how the sausage is made per se. They come in as users, and then they go back with whatever they've come across. And the artist knows how it's made, they're making it. And there's that self-reflexive element of it that puts the object into play. It doesn't tie it to a very specific meaning. And I don't think that necessarily, that scholars are necessarily doomed to do that. But I think in the way that humanities have really addressed this increasingly, that the archive offers evidence. But the scholar has to bring cross-examination, not belief. And what I was trying to point out here, because I just found it this remarkable coincidence that Raphael and the National Archives are both born the same year. And the archive's trying to make Raphael an object of the past, as an ethnic subject, as a colonial subject. And that's just so deeply ingrained in the history of the archive and of the National Archives and archives in general. And what I found amazing is that, I went online and I looked at the National Archives website, and they're still telling that same story. But as we know, I mean, over the last 2 years, and going back further, a lot of these issues have really come up for question in terms of the role of race, in terms of indigeneity, that what an object is goes beyond a purely rational framework. And I guess this comes back to the question of destruction that you asked. The cathartic use of art, I think, has been largely dismissed. It's seen as a very limited strategy, and it's a belief that it's a belief in Hollywood that the release of emotions can solve the problems, right? But I think what Raphael's doing is different. He's using that language. That was the language of the times 60 years ago. But he's also deeply informed about neuroscience and psychoanalysis. He was part of a test subject. He was a test subject at the White Institute, which was the first institute advocating neo-Freudian psychoanalysis. So this is taking the kind of rudiments of Freudian psychoanalysis and combining it to a social project. He was there for 10 years. But also as a student at the Pratt Institute, one of the amazing things was that the undergrads had to read contemporary scholarly articles in the fields that they were being introduced to as part of the foundation, including psychology. And so when he's coming up with this idea of catharsis, I mean, when he's coming up with this framework of destructivism, and it can be described as by catharsis, it's also based on an understanding of humans as not being, part of the cogito, I think, therefore I am. That the identity and the meaning and the importance of a person is in their rational thought. He's looking at the three brain system that's being articulated in the late 50s, in which you have the automatic part of the brain, it's kind of doing breathing, heartbeats and things like that. You have the processing of emotions and physical responses as well. And then you have rational thought. That's a kind of crude framing, but it was being looked at in a scientific framework, and it more or less continues with slightly different understandings of what's happening in each of those areas and how distinct they are. That's a very different model of the human being. To say that you are, what you say you are, that your rational thought is the definition of you, completely ignores all the other things going on in which you have no control or very limited control. And I think that the turn to destruction was an attempt to connect people with that. And again, to go back, Raphael's notion of art, and I think the notion of art that was emerging initially out of Bauhaus and then out of places like Pratt that were influenced by the curriculum and the foundation, is that art is not an object that has been made by an intentional being. Art is the product of a body. And so it's really shifting that sense of where art is. Is it the object that's made, or is it somewhere between the object and the body that is in the process of making that object? These are all very different ways of thinking about what the arts are. And he's really riffing on this very interesting curriculum that's been created, from the 20s onward through the 60s, as the arts go from this ideal of a patron and an artist to the reality of artists who will primarily make their living teaching. So Raphael has degrees in art education, not studio art. And that is part of a shift that begins in the 30s in the United States, whereby the reality is most artists will make their living as a teacher. Well, how do you bring all of those elements together? Are these compartmentalized, or is it part of a larger vision of what the arts are? That's a kind of roundabout answer. I mean, I appreciate that you sent me those questions, because I'm going to be mulling over them the rest of the summer.
I can come back to them too.
And you mentioned gender, and I think what's really interesting was Raphael's an artist, like many artists, you can't look to them for thematic or programmatic descriptions of things. He has written many manifestos, and they do lay out broad frameworks and ideas. But the work is really something quite distinct from that.
I didn't actually mention gender. I didn't mention gender, actually. I did mention women.
Right, you're right.
And I did mention,
mistake.
yeah, I did mention women, and I was just interested in how he might have collaborated.
Yeah.
There were so many artists at the time doing process-based work, and he was coming more just a generation a little earlier than that. With his work in the 50s and 60s, that also reflected some action-based work and actionism, even though he wasn't defining his work that way.
Yeah.
But I kind of was interested in, you know, was he in his activist practice with the folks who were protesting the Vietnam War in MoMA, the people who were helping organize the El Museo del Barrio, was he working in collaboration with specific feminist artists, women activists, other people in his community? How might they become part of the story of his creative practice? That was really the question.
Yeah, and what I've always found fascinating is he had quite a number of collaborations throughout his career with women artists as well. And I think probably among the closest would be Lil Picard, who had come from Germany. She was in her late 60s and was very actively a part of the kind of activities at Judson Church that happened in the second wave after the Alan Capro and Happenings kind of early phase, more tied to music. And then what happened under John Hendricks, he was kind of the organizer of the second wave of that. And they were regular collaborators. You know, he was always been a kind of a lone wolf, as he would say. And he was adamant about having never worked with Warhol. And then I found that, you know, well, he did because Lil Picard asked him to be in a film that she was shooting, Construction, Destruction, Construction. And the other ongoing collaborator was Charlotte Mormon, who organized the New York Avant-Garde Festival, annual festival, and he took part in most of them. And he collaborated with her more so than, say, Nam June Paik, who was her partner at one point. As a student with Muriel Latterman Kelly's, they were the two students that really, I think, were on the cutting edge of what of the students moving away from abstract expressionism. They were being fully encouraged and supported by Robert Richenberg. And in fact, he would be fired for supporting their work, in particular, Latterman Kelly's work in her master's thesis, which involved the use of tampons and other objects like that. And they told him he had to remove the work, and he refused, and they fired him. And that was the end of he was a pretty well-recognized abstract painter from the club, the original group of abstract painters. Once he left New York, that was kind of the end of his career. But he had the integrity to say, one, you don't have to be like me. You can do what you want, and I encourage you to define it. And I think with both of them, he was very challenging in saying, you know, you do the work, do the research, you know, and they both became polemicists in a way. Muriel Latterman Kelly's is considered to have done one of the first feminist manifestos. And Raphael does the first destructivist manifesto, you know, starting in the late 50s at the insistence of Richenberg. I don't know if that gets at all of it. I've always been surprised at the fact that he has, throughout his career, collaborated with women and had ongoing professional relationships with them, in whether they were critics or artists, curators. It's been kind of interesting. So I don't know if that fully answered it, but
Thanks.
Well, maybe
Great.
I'll jump in now. Oh, I'm sorry.
Roberto, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, first, thank you for the very elegant and complex lecture, and Jennifer, for your insightful questions, and now for your responses. I might be able to create a sort of underside to this question of destruction, because it seems to me that what I'm interested in particular, as you know, is the scene and the creation of the scene of writing. And you know, the lecture and the writing around it that I'm familiar with, you begin with this time travel, and I'm interested in maybe elaborating this idea of a different kind of history. But you also begin with at least two identities, that of the writer and that of the curator, which is that the writer looks at documents and archives, and the curator looks at objects in space. And there's a kind of double pathway throughout the whole lecture, which is really interesting to me. And it's what I would say then, and I'll sort of jump to the question, but I'll advance it by saying I'm interested in what I would consider a critical poetics, because I think what you're interested in is opening up the research imagination, looking at making and knowing as parallel pathways. The idea, very evocative idea, that not only is history not a fullness, but that an artist like Ortiz is also looking at the lack of fullness in the human subject as well. And that you're activating a knowledge that's irreducible to one frame or one discipline. So in this, there are all these kind of pairings that take place, and not just that it ends with the two pairings of the statues, right? The past and the future, and the guardianship and the heritage. But these pairings are really important to the way that you're arguing this beautiful text, right? On the one hand, home, as Jennifer rightly points out, what is its opposite? Well, sometimes it's the institution, correct? That somehow institutional evidence in that, it's kind of this gift, this marvelous idiosyncratic critical irony that Ortiz was born on, the year of the founding of the National Archives, and that he was born with his birth certificate saying one thing, the state, and the memory of the mother, that is kind of other kinds of narratives saying otherwise, and that the past and present are kind of hinging on this, and that the work, which really encompasses this broad view of history from the conquest and the colonial project to the Holocaust, uses the domestic object, home, as the center point, right? It is that domestic object that is destroyed, and you beautifully say that to explore that relationship is a direct relationship between home and art. It's also a zero-sum relationship, right, between home and the art world, which is then therefore also in the pairing of the incommensurability between nationality and citizenship, right? Two forms of belonging. So all these are kind of pairings, but the question really is, perhaps, do you see the poetics that you're activating as a kind of model for feeling oneself in the present? Because I think that what you're offering in the figure of Ortiz is a way of looking at the present and artworks as being critical to thinking through the present, in what Jennifer already discussed, is we're living in the unprecedented condition of mass migration at this incredible global scale. And it seems to me that Rafael Ortiz's work has something to teach us, as does the method that you've used, the time travel, the hopscotch, to avoid the pitfalls and the idea that the present is an inevitability if we take cause and effect to its ultimate consequences.
Wow, Roberto. Yes. Trying to think where to kind of grab onto that, because
well, maybe just beginning like with your self-awareness of the kind of this different kind of history that you're writing.
Well, I was not trained in art history. I had an art appreciation class as an undergraduate. It was a somewhat problematic class, and because it was the 70s. In retrospect, like. And when I agreed to do this, my initial interest in Rafael was, finding out that he was a filmmaker, and I'm a film scholar. But in committing to write about his body of work, I realized that, I had to really become familiar with a wider range of work, but also I had to become familiar with the wider range even of his readings. This is somebody who's a 10-year-old boy. I was reading Havelock Ellis's Study in the Psychology of Sex. 6 volumes. I had to read them. It's because I had to figure out what are the frameworks and ways of thinking I was able to identify that he really was drawn, as I was as a kid. I'm at the tail end of a phenomenon that he was part of the, and I'm forgetting what it's called, but yikes, I've completely forgotten the name of this, but he was drawn to intellectuals like Ellis, like Huxley, who were polymath. They were polymath intellectuals. They were trying to integrate across a wide range of disciplines. And their work has the faults of such an effort, but it also has the ambition and a commitment to certain notions of humanity that they share, right? And you can look at these works and dismiss them and say, well, that's not accurate. Or you can look at what they were trying to capture and the fact that they're also acknowledging that you cannot definitively capture anything. That we're not God, you know, in that sense, right? And to how to live with that and how to be ethical with that and how to advance knowledge with that. What that did is it made me question everything I thought I knew. And when I'm writing, I spend most of my time looking up words and then finding out what happens when you go down the rabbit hole of a dictionary, that a word is less an index of something in the world than it is a loose net through which you try to kind of navigate your way towards something. And what I find in terms of you're talking about methodology, in writing about Raphael's work, I spend so much time falling into the language and really look at what's happening in very subtle maneuvers and shifts in the language. When Raphael's coining destructivism and destruct, that word didn't exist. We now know it now thanks to Mission Impossible in the 1960s. You know, this will self-destruct. It's a term that comes out of the military when they're beginning to learn how to shoot rockets and things like that. And he is there at that moment coming to that word through a different pathway as an artist. He's doing it in a course that he's taking with Dora Ashton, the art historian who had actually been a critic for the New York Times. And she was fired because she advocated modernism and the chief curator, John Cannaday, didn't, and he felt threatened by her. So she got fired, and there was a big national, the National Association of Art Critics kind of condemned the New York Times for all that that did. And then she went into teaching. She believed that language could be used to clearly express concrete things. And Raphael believed that we are better served by taking things apart and understanding how they came to us as products, as things, and how we might be ill-served by them, right? I mean, he still has a couch and he has a bed, you know, things like that. But the process of really being open to that kind of a breakdown, he would later call it deconstruction, but I think destructivist is really the appropriate word. And what I found is, you know, Raphael, they're roughly the same age. He's a returning older student, and her comments on his papers are just like invaluable, because you see two radically different worldviews. The worldview of the art critic as a rational eyeball. In other words, you're engaging the work purely on the basis of vision and rationality. And Raphael approaching things as an entire body with a conflicted mind, you know, that is not all oriented in one direction, but a collage of many different generations of cerebral development, different brains evolving. And that's the machine we are, that is the entity we are. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we don't open ourselves to all of that, we will be destructive and we will rationalize it. In other words, we will use that rationality to make excuses, right? I think that's a phenomenal thing. And it really made me have to change my game and try to really think through the complexity of what's happening and how to avoid falling into some of the easy narratives that exist in history writing, and particularly in art history. where, and you know this, you did a beautiful job in the book on Celia Alvarez Munoz in rejecting the developmental narrative. And you used a poetic framework tied to family history that really tells a very different kind of story about the relationship of the artist, of families, and the shifts taking place in
Global history.
Cultural conflict that's nationally decided, it's geographical, and that's you can never escape it with the definitive alternative. You have to just keep attentive to these tendencies, and the one I struggle with consistently is avoiding looking into the face of the artist as a child and seeing an old man there who knows everything, who knows his life at this point, without claiming to actually, I can't claim to know the child. I can only see the traces. I can see what's happening around him through various sources, and I have to question each of those sources so intensely and to avoid coming down with a sentimental or a moral kind of conclusion. And fortunately, Raphael's here, and when I have kind of crossed that line, he has kind of nailed me on it, and I find that very useful. To say, no, you can't come to that conclusion.
It's almost as if you've taken his phrase of the messy contingency of the studio and applied it to the messy contingency of the writing of history.
Exactly, and I'm not showing my office here because people will get a very clear image of that. It's a juggling act. So I don't mean to kind of go on at too much length about this, but
I wanted to bring it back. Oh, I'm sorry, Roberto, go ahead.
Just because it occurred to me as you were talking about catharsis, there is an interesting move at the end of your lecture, which is maybe related to catharsis, which is that you want to make a special description for Ortiz's understanding of abstraction, that somehow abstraction that come from these destroyed objects somehow is, I think the term you is written into the conflicted self or the incomplete self as well.
Yeah, I've been struggling with that. I thought I knew, and I thought that abstract expressionism was the boogeyman, because he started as an abstract painter and then moved into destruction. And I didn't speak about this, but I've been grappling with it for this year, coming to realize that there's two sides to abstraction, right? And abstract expressionism tries to play one side of it against the kind of hyper logical mathematical framework of abstraction that is a kind of the key methodology or a key methodology in science. Although what math is much different than what it was 100, 200, 300 years ago. And I've been kind of grappling with the fact that he actually, I am of the opinion that he actually formed his ideas about destructivism through abstract painting. And that he did it in dialogue with Robert Richenberg, and that the two of them together, and in their dialogues and in the work that they were doing at that time, went through a pretty profound change in their understanding of what art could do and what the platform for art was. And it's, most people nobody disagreed with the idea that the platform for a painting is canvas, right? You're answering me. Nicely done, Robert. Yes, University of Houston. And I think what they worked through was that it's not canvas. And Richenberg found a way to create the alternative and continue as a painter. And I think Raphael realized he had to go into more like sculpture in terms of working with built objects. in order to show what was beneath and what is above, and also to kind of break the thingedness of the object in terms of its relationship to us, right? And to give it another role to play and make it into another thing, which is an art object.
Yeah, which is tied to what both you and Jennifer were saying just about that that Ortiz is creating when the world is being destroyed. It might have been called the Anthropocene today, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or really, I was trying to think about how he invites us to think about destruction as a mode of human process.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to think about it more, since it seems to be a problem we carry with us generation after generation. And I wanted to just pursue the question of art a little further, Chon. I know you're familiar with art history during the period when Ortiz is working, and he's clearly not working within the kind of clean lines of minimalism or hard edge painting, but and the reason, in a way, that I raised the question about women is that there was an iconoclastic impulse in a lot of process art and feminist art in a period just following him. So he's working the 50s and 60s in that early destruction art, and then they're coming in just a little later. And they were also kind of pushing back against abstract expressionism, and they were also pushing back against a kind of minimalism. And what I really love about Raphael's work is that he is an ecumenical kind of practitioner who is willing to delve into personal history, think about texture, and play with surfaces. And in a way, he's a painterly sculptor. When he moves into destruction art, he really thinks about where he wants to break things apart. And so the process is a kind of a painterly action, although it's definitely not painting. And I wanted to think more about other artists that might have been operating in a similar vein that he might have been in conversation with. You mentioned Charlotte Moorman and Namjoon Pike. You mentioned others, and I was thinking about how he might also have been in conversation with the political activist forms of representation of Latinx artists, so Chicano artists, other Puerto Rican artists, Dominican artists. And I wonder if you just want to shout out a few more people who he might have been in touch with visually, conceptually, from those communities in this. I mean, it's a long career, and I know you're really looking at one kind of, for us today, a kind of specific historical moment, but maybe expand a little out for us and see if there's more we can learn about him on that front.
Yeah, I mean, there was no lack of kind of groups that were formed on an ad hoc basis. I think, in his early work at Judson Church and organizing the Destruction and Art Symposium 2 in New York, following the one in London that we saw in the video.
Right.
He, I think, was a very key influence and kind of organizing point for the group that became known as the Guerrilla Art Action Group. And if you look at their documents, it's kind of interesting because they retrospectively create their origin. But I think a lot of it had to do with the collaborations and working with Raphael. And as I understand it, he actually suggested the idea that they form a group. He was also working with Richard Schechner and John McIntosh at the performance group. And as I mentioned in the talk, so there were a lot of these groups in New York that he was actively moving among. And then in the creation of El Museo del Barrio, I think really became a focal point in terms of kind of the institutional efforts to create organizations, to create groups, in a very strategic sense. And I think it was really a unique skill he had, and still does, to kind of think in that way about, it's almost like playing chess, what this helps you do, how it helps you kind of advance. in terms of influences, I think the New Realist group were very influential, and he happened to be kind of grappling with these issues at precisely that time where they're being shown a lot in New York City. And then with the Destruction and Art Symposium in London, he meets an international group of artists.
Right.
The Vienna Actionists is a group that he kind of finds most kind of alignment with, in particular Hermann Nietzsche, who recently passed away. And the two of them did a number of collaborations in New York, and Raphael would travel to Europe as well to participate in actions there. So I think that's a broader context for that, and it's interesting. I think part of it is at that time in the 60s as well. I try to draw them out about this. That there's a lot of activity, and people are running into each other at openings and going back and occasionally finding kind of ways to actually collaborate or participate together. And I think the event that kind of Raphael came up with and curated, as it were, 12 evenings of manipulations at Judson Church, was really very pivotal. It just brought a kind of what would be now the who's who list of action-based artists together over a series of nights. It got got covered quite extensively, and I think really helped consolidate that generation, as you said. I don't know if I missed something as well, but Deborah Padilla is saying that was the question she wanted to ask. So, so I think I think we're getting near the end of our time, and I'm supposed to do something here. I think I got so caught up talking with you guys that I realized I have to kind of look back at our playlist here. And
there's lots of warmth in the chat room.
Yes, thank you for these posts, and I'm going to have to read them, and I'll just point out that Anna Perry, who's posted this very long thing, I won't have a chance to read, but I'll just identify her as someone who's writing a dissertation on a section of a period of Raphael's work, I think in early 1970s, and is now teaching, and is really the next generation. And she's been to UCLA, and she's gone through the archival collections, and we're hoping she's part of a symposium that we want to hold for the retrospective in New York in September. So it's great to see her up there, and I'll just end by noting that Armando Duron's posting, and he's one of the kind of main Chicano art collectors. And I first became aware of Raphael's work reading Jacinto Quirarte's Mexican-American Artist. And there's actually quite a few pages. He's one of the more lengthily written about artists, because when he met Jacinto, he shared with him the fact of his Mexican heritage and is part of the family history. And what Quirarte has to write about is very insightful in terms of the nature of that particular type of recuperative work that Raphael was engaging in at that time. So I think with that, I do need to wrap up, and I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. I want to just note that the lecture will be available to watch again or share with your friends on the event website. And I think that's more or less it. Jennifer, Roberto, you want to?
Just thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this incredible work, both of Rafael Ortiz and your perspective on it.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you both.
Thank you, Rafael, for the work.
Totally challenged me. You kind of raised the stakes, and I really appreciate that. And I want to just note that the music you all heard at the very beginning was a group that I keep Los Tres Charos, and they actually were the house band for a restaurant in Rancho Cucamonga called oh my God, Mayo de something. It no longer exists anymore, and they recorded that song in Cucucucuru,
was my favorite song growing up as a kid, and I'd always asked my dad to sing it. So when I saw this little bit of kind of LA history, you know, this restaurant band that produced an album of classics, I just had to play it. And what you may hear at the end, you will be the first people to hear this since 1966. But it's an excerpt from the Piano Destruction concert, I believe the first one. And that was not done for media at the Destruction and Art Symposium in 1966, and you'll hear a bit of the person who commissioned the work at his home with his piano and had several other destructions, and the kind of interesting dialogue they have about what's going to happen and whether the police are going to be involved or not. I hope you enjoy that. It's part of a preservation project we're doing of all of Raphael's audio and media work. So thank you. I guess we
Thank you, Chon.
Thank you, Chon. Thank you, Jennifer.
Nice to see you, Roberto.
Good to see you.